Well, I grew up in Southern California. We were involved in a Reform Jewish temple, so we were not real observant, kind of a relaxed level of Jewish life, but culturally it was very Jewish. All of my family and family's friends were all Jews from New York. I grew up in Southern California, but everybody had New York accents. And, the culture was very Jewish, and we were religious enough that I and my two brothers both had bar mitzvah celebration. So when I was 13, coming of age as a Jewish boy, I had learned enough Hebrew to read from the old Torah scroll. And I really loved it. I loved learning Hebrew. I actually, unlike a lot of my Jewish friends, I actually really loved going to services and being in the temple, but I kind of left it behind. It's an old Jewish tradition. You leave it all behind at your bar mitzvah. There's a joke about the guardian, the caretaker of a synagogue, and the rabbi are talking. They've got mice in the synagogue, and they can't figure out how to get rid of the mice. And finally, the caretaker says, "Rabbi, I know what we can do to keep these mice out of the synagogue. We'll give them all a bar mitzvah and we'll never see them again." So I followed that tradition and got kind of swept up into the counterculture in the late 60s. And, I was always Jewish, but I felt like the Jewish religion per se was something that I had kind of transcended on my journey.
Now, you said that you actually began to enter the counterculture, we'll call it hippie life. So this was in California. So how did you get from California to New Mexico?
Well, I went through a couple of years of college. I went to UC Santa Cruz, and in those days it was kind of like almost required that you drop out. So I dropped out in the middle of my academic career and was kind of adrift. And one day, a friend of mine proposed that we take an adventure, a hitchhiking trip. And our destination was a commune in New Mexico. And this is like 1,200 miles away, but that seemed like this is going to be a fun adventure. And it was a commune where another former college mate, former student of mine, a friend of mine, Andrew Shishkoff, was on the commune. So we hitchhiked out, and as soon as we got to the high desert region in Arizona, it's like something in my soul just kind of lifted, and I knew this is where I need to be. And I came to New Mexico, and that was even more where I need to be. And it was a real hippie mecca in those days. There were communes really throughout the high country, the mountains of northern New Mexico. I moved to a little kind of an abandoned little rancho near Placitas, New Mexico. And we had a very primitive lifestyle. It was really, I would say, a 19th century lifestyle. We had no electricity, no running water. We went for periods of time without even having a motor vehicle, just trying to live off the land. And, a minor detail was that to really survive, we had to hitchhike into town to get our food stamps. But we were trying to become self-sufficient. Near Placitas, we lived in a little river valley or creek valley that was really well watered and had a pretty good climate. And so we were growing tomatoes and chilies and corn and all the traditional New Mexico stuff. In Placitas, we also were growing marijuana in our field. One day, the sheriff from Bernalillo came to visit us, who was friendly with the hippies. And he was standing there, chatting with us, looking out at our field and saying, the other day I had to bust a bunch of hippies up in the Jemez because they were growing pot and selling pot out in the open. I hated to do it, but I had to bust them. And he's staring at and we were like, wow, that's too bad, man, far out. And he left, and about 3 days later, 3 state police cars pulled up and hauled off 11 of us. I ended up taking doing a plea bargain where I pled guilty to 1 count, and they dropped the charges on everybody else because I was the only one with a clean enough record to do a plea bargain. And as I was standing before the judge, it was like my life encountered me, got in my face, as we say. And, it's like, is it worth risking my freedom and jeopardizing my whole life, so I could smoke some pot now and then? And it was really the start of a turn, I believe, turn toward God, or God calling me. Near Placidus, I met my wife-to-be, Jane, who was from New York. We really kind of ran off together, to be together, to find this new place up in the mountains. We were told by some of our hippie friends that this was a good place to live because it was really lush and green and well watered, which, as you know, is kind of rare in New Mexico. Minor detail, it's 8,000 feet elevation, so you get a little chilly in the winter. But we moved up there and found a little 80-acre rancho that was owned by a man in town, and he agreed to let us sharecrop there. We discovered we couldn't grow chilies and tomatoes and stuff like that, but we grew potatoes. They did great. And turnips. To store our crops, potatoes and turnips, we dug a root cellar. This is the old traditional way you store crops like this. And one day as we were digging our root cellar, Andrew and I, Andrew and Connie Shishkoff came to live with us on this same farm. We were digging our root cellar, and one of our neighbors came to us and told us that a hippie friend who lived about an hour away from us had been murdered. His name was Mel. He picked up a hitchhiker and brought him home, and after a few days the hitchhiker came up behind him and shot him with his deer rifle and stole his Jeep and ran off. And that was really kind of like the standing before the judge had been. It was sort of an encounter with my life, that this whole hippie ideal, the whole idea, of karma, do good and good will come back to you, and that we'd escape the corruptions of society and we're living this pure life in the mountains, that really all came crashing down on our heads. And I was really launched anew on a search for meaning, for direction, for reality. So at Mel's funeral, one of our hippie friends invited my wife Jane to come back down to Placidus and stock up on some of those, winter supply, the things you could grow down there for the winter. This was in September. She went down, she had our two little boys with her. They got sick and she was stranded on this commune. And all these hippies on the commune were too spaced out to help her with the kids. It was really a bad thing. She finally got a ride to Bernalillo, to a good place to hitchhike. And as they pulled up to the hitchhike spot, my wife Jane just prayed, God, please get me home. She's not Jewish. She was raised in the Presbyterian church and, had some concept of God up there, or the Great Spirit. But she prayed, God, please get me home, because she's stranded with hundreds of pounds of supplies, these two sick kids. She gets picked up by a Jesus bus. And you know how the buses have like above the windshield it has the destination, Los Angeles, Chicago, whatever. This one said heaven on it. And she just hoped it wasn't on that specific trip that it was going to end up in heaven. But they started telling her about, we didn't say Yeshua in those days, about Jesus, and you need to invite Jesus into your heart. And they were really nice, they were really helpful in contrast with the hippies. And after a while she asked if she could just take a break in the back of the bus. And she did what they said. She invited Jesus into her heart on the way home.
Marvelous.
Jane tells me that when she came home, she was kind of nervous about telling me, a nice Jewish boy, that she'd just accepted Jesus. Like I said, she's not Jewish, but she grew up in White Plains, New York, and was a very Jewish area and very familiar with the culture. When I told you I accepted Jesus, you said, well, that's far out. I've been kind of thinking about and reading about Jesus lately, And I had been starting to read the New Testament, and during the winter I read the great Russian novels, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, who have some very compelling Christian characters in them. And I was kind of looking into this thing. So Jane invited a couple of the hippies, or not the hippies, the Jesus freaks, if you don't mind that terminology, from the bus to come over for dinner one night. They were actually staying at a house fairly close to us. And, they're from New Jersey. They didn't know how to cook. They didn't know from pinto beans. They didn't know what they were doing. So she invited them to come over for dinner. And after dinner, by the kerosene lamp, these two Jesus freaks who had been believers in Jesus like about 6 months themselves were witnessing to me and to Andrew. And they said, do you guys want to know God? Do you want to have the Spirit of God in your life? And we said, yeah, that's what we're doing out here. That's what this hippie quest of ours is all about. And they said, you need to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, that he rose from the dead. You need to believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, and you need to confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord. Yeah. Which is pure scripture, Romans 10. But they had no idea of how hard it is for a nice Jewish boy from LA who doesn't use bad language to say Jesus is Lord. I believed it. When they told me, it was like, I can't believe it, but this is true. I mean, it's like the God of the Gentiles. I just saw that he is the Messiah. But I couldn't say the words. It took 3 days before I could make the confession of faith. We stayed up in the mountains for 2 years, partly through the help and reinforcement of Shalom Ministries, who was reaching out to us.
I remember one of the potluck dinners we had there, all the dishes out on the table, every single one of them were beans. That was all beans.
That's what you eat. Yeah, we stayed up there about 2 years, and we started going to a Spanish Assembly of God church, which was really amazing. We would come in, and we had no concept of what was normal, so it was like, yeah, I think they have a service on Sunday night. We would never go Sunday morning because we were working on the farm on the morning, but at night we could go. And it starts, sometime around dark or whatever. And so we would get as cleaned up as we could under the kerosene lamp and get our kids as cleaned up as we could, throw them in the back of the pickup truck and come into the middle of the service. They would welcome us literally with open arms. Pastor Lemus, Brother Lemus, would switch from Spanish to English to welcome us. The little old ladies would take our kids on their laps so they didn't distract us, and we would hear the Word of God and receive the welcome of God, just as important. As well as crediting you and Shalom, for really helping us to stay on course. I really credit this church and their welcome for helping us to really move forward. And
they basically took you on as a mission, like Shalom did. And they said, Pastor Lima said that whenever you arrived, they would just, at that point, start their service over. Just for you. The service started when you arrived. Even if they had been going a half hour or hour. How many churches would do that?
It was amazing. They weren't worried about our appearance or our being Anglos instead of Spanish. After a couple of years in the mountains, our children were ready to go to school, and that would have involved like about 3 hours on the bus, about an hour and a half bus ride, either way. To go to school, it would have involved washing clothes by hand. But also spiritually, we were feeling like we really need to be more grounded. We need discipleship, we need training and teaching. And Andrew was attracted. He actually came and pretty soon joined on staff at Shalom, right? We were led to Albuquerque because of our farming experience, such as it was as hippies. This is a drug rehab center that was on a 72-acre farm, and they needed a farm manager. Now I'm on staff, bringing the gospel and bringing healing and redemption to hardcore heroin addicts, ex-convicts, alcoholics. Saw many miracles and real successes in people getting free. I said I was kind of amazed to find that Jesus was the Messiah, and that the Gentiles had it right on that score. But I was also amazed that after I accepted Jesus, my Jewish identity just wouldn't leave me alone. It was like a calling, a a pull from God. Couldn't figure out how to make the two work together, Jesus and being Jewish. And really wrestled with that for several years. While we were at DARE, we met an older messianic Jewish pioneer by the name of Eliezer Urbach. He was of my parents' generation, had escaped Hitler's invasion of Poland. He grew up in Poland, fled from Hitler at the age of 17, served in the Red Army, made it through World War II, went to Israel, served in the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, in the Israel War of Independence, and after many other adventures became a believer in Jesus in Brazil in the 50s, and then went back to Israel. He was like a walking monument of Jewish history. And one day he said to me, "Russell, with one tuchus you can't dance at two weddings." Now, if you don't know what a tuchus is, it's your rear end, to put it politely. So with one tuchus you can't dance at two weddings. Either your children will be in the Christmas pageant or the Hanukkah play. And I knew that I wanted them to be in the Hanukkah play.
Yeah.
We met Yeshua. Yeshua entered our lives in the fall of 1972. 10 years later, we really got another calling into this Messianic Jewish identity, which simply means affirming, living out your Jewish identity and calling in an intentional way as a believer in Jesus. For hundreds of years, if a Jew accepted Jesus, he was expected to leave it all behind. And in some circles, he still is.
Yeah.
But Messianic Judaism, as we understand it, is saying Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. The New Testament is written by Jews. Its early followers were Jews. And your Jewish identity has been maintained, sustained by God, given to you through the generations. So walk it out as a follower of Jesus.
So what steps led you to actually establish the first Messianic congregation in Albuquerque? Adopt Yeshua.
Yeah, we, by this time, I was actually an elder. I was a very younger elder in a church that was pro-Israel, pro-Jewish, and very supportive. And we had a home group that I led that was about 24 people. Half of us were Jewish, and most of the rest were spouses, of Jewish people. So it was mostly a Jewish home fellowship. And some of the members said, we should be a synagogue, we should be a congregation, we should meet on Shabbat. And finally, one of my hippie friends said, "I'm tired of arguing with you," because I was resisting the whole idea of separate Messianic congregation. So finally, one of my friends, was tired of arguing about it, and he sent me to a Messianic Jew, and Jane, my wife, both of us, to a Messianic Jewish conference where there were hundreds of Messianic Jews, and they were, mostly parts of Messianic congregations. We just had a sense that the Messianic Jewish movement was not just like a cool idea of a bunch of ex-hippies, but it was really the Spirit of God. The same year, Eliezer, he sent me to a conference of a new organization called the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. The first conference was a lot more like celebratory, and this would have more substance to it for me. They talked to me about my home group, and they said, well, you could join as an associate member, just your home fellowship, and let's see what happens. So we joined, very soon received the blessing of the other elders of this church to launch a Messianic congregation. That was 83, 84, somewhere in there. Took hold very, very well and grew, pretty quickly. I mean, Messianic congregations tend to be pretty small. I was able to go in 1992, about 8 years into it, I was able to quit all my other jobs and be full-time leader of the congregation, which was kind of a milestone. And we actually had a building at that time. Okay, how did I become executive director of the UMJC? The UMJC was a real major encouragement to us, especially here in Albuquerque, because we're kind of isolated in terms of the Messianic Jewish community. And so being related to other congregations and other leaders was really helpful. And I got quite involved. 5 or 6 years into it, I became the Southwest Regional Coordinator.
Mm-hmm.
I'd been, by that time, the leader of the local congregation for, about 15 years, 15 or 16 years. And, I was kind of ready to take on some new challenges. So I applied and was interviewed, and since they hadn't had anybody in 7 years, I looked pretty good. And by that time, I was on the executive committee, and I just felt like, just a calling that I could serve in this capacity as general secretary.
And how many congregations worldwide are there?
Well, it's an interesting question. The union is about 75 congregations.
Okay.
We have a sister organization that we cooperate with closely, but it's kind of a different organization, different emphasis, and they have about 120 or so congregation members. But there's a lot more outside of those two large affiliations. The issue is, how do you define a Messianic Jewish congregation?
Sure.
And this is really something that the union has spearheaded. Is we're known as kind of the scholarly, the thinking man's union, because a lot of the scholars and thinkers in the Messianic Jewish world are affiliated with the union. So we've defined Messianic Judaism as a movement among the Jewish people, movement within the Jewish community for Yeshua, who is the Messiah of Israel. That's a pretty simple definition, but a lot of people use the label Messianic Jewish to designate a gathering that might not even include Jewish people, but it loves Jewish things, loves Israel, and God bless them, but that's not, we have a more focused definition.
About how many Messianic Jews would there be worldwide in, say, 1972 as opposed to today?
Well,
Yeah,
I mean, the numbers have mushroomed, exploded. If you use the narrow definition that I used, we're actually still a very small movement. We'd be numbered in the thousands.
Yeah.
If you use a wider definition of Jews who affirm Jesus as Messiah, it's probably hundreds of thousands. I said since the early 70s, it's just mushroomed by either category, either way you define it, it's exploded. The other thing that's really remarkable is that the Christian gatekeepers have really, by and large, accepted and affirmed this move of the Holy Spirit among the Jewish people. It used to be a generation ago that we were looked upon as kind of, weirdos and maybe even heretics by continuing to affirm Jewish life.
Yes.
By having a positive attitude toward the Torah, which in the Christian world is called the law.
Right.
We like the law.
Yeah.
Amazingly, one of the biggest changes was in the official ranks of the Catholic Church. The official position and statements in the Catholic Church have really repented of anti-Semitism, of anti-Judaism, repented of replacement theology, the idea that the church replaces Israel.
Right.
And have really shown a tremendous understanding of what God is doing among the Jewish people. So you have that, and then you have, like Brother Lemus, who understands it, understood it 40 years ago and still does.
One of the big events in the Christian community, at least certain segments, is what we would call the return of the Messiah.
Right.
Anticipating that day that Jesus comes back and he establishes, is God preparing Israel for this event as he is preparing the church?
Yeah, one of our favorite verses is the end of Matthew 23, where Jesus looks out at Jerusalem and says, "You will not see me again until you say to me, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So Yeshua said, "You're not going to see me, Jerusalem, until you welcome me." We're enough of biblical literalists. We believe that there's going to be a Jewish welcome to Yeshua, but the return of the Messiah is linked to a Jewish corporate acceptance. In America, after a time of explosive growth, we've been kind of plateaued for a while. In Israel, the Messianic Jewish community is in the middle of explosive growth.
Great.
And the amazing thing that's happened in the past few years is that the leadership is finally beginning to be transferred to native-born, native-speaking, Hebrew-speaking Israelis. The Messianic Jewish community in Israel for many years was predominantly immigrant. Just one real quick evidence of that is the number of Messianic Jews in the Israel Defense Force who have really gained a reputation for being excellent soldiers. It's kind of admitted, throughout Israeli society.
Wow.
And that's just part of that whole move of restoration that's on the way.
And then today, he is the overseer of over 100 Messianic congregations worldwide. Well, Russell, as a pioneer of this, you might say the Messianic Jewish movement, you've written some books.
Yeah.
Did you bring some of those? You can maybe...
It's amazing when we talk about the writing thing. I remember Eitan came, we got together in the mid-'80s for a camping adventure. And Eitan and I were in the truck, we were praying, and I said to Eitan, I really want to write. This is 1986. And I need a computer, one of these new word processors to write with. And we prayed for that. A long time already now, it's the year 2000. I wrote my first book that's still in print called Gateways to Torah. And in the Jewish world, we read the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. In the synagogue, we read it through every year. Every week, every synagogue is reading the same portion. And so over the centuries, a really rich literature of commentary and discussion on the Torah portion has developed. And I began reading that in the 90s and really enjoying it, really gaining a lot of insight. And I wanted to participate in that discussion as a Messianic Jew, because this is all traditional Jewish material. And so this book is a commentary on the entire 5 books of Moses, week by week, portion by portion, absorbing and interacting with Jewish sources, but very much centered on Yeshua as the Messiah and drawing on the New Testament. And it was kind of, a pioneering effort. There's a lot of this material out now in the Messianic Jewish world, but this was a very early effort. Several years later, I wrote a second one, Creation to Completion. In this book, I went through the weekly portions again, but from a different angle. That I think the overarching theme of the 5 books of Moses is the restoration of creation, the creation and its restoration. And that's what unifies the whole narrative of the 5 books of Moses and really the whole Bible. Creation, revelation, and then the consummation, the age to come. And all those themes play throughout the 5 books of Moses. And so this commentary really traces that theme of from creation to completion. And this one I would actually recommend for a newcomer. This would be a good starting point because it gives a little more context. A few years after that, I wrote my Yeshua book, Divine Reversal, The Transforming Ethics of Jesus. It goes through the Gospels, but very much looking at Yeshua as a teacher of a way of life, and a way of life that instructs us, that he's our Savior, but he's also our leader, our teacher, our guide. And so this deals a lot with the ethical dimension. Primarily, I come into focus on Matthew chapter 5. Cover the whole gospel account, but spend a lot of time on Matthew 5. I'm working now on a book on the life of Joseph. I'm looking at Joseph through the perspective of family dynamics and even some family therapy. In the middle of this whole story, I went back to school, got a master's degree, became a certified clinical mental health counselor. So I'm wearing my certified clinical mental health counselor hat and my rabbi hat as I'm writing the Joseph book. Just because I don't want to be, a 21st century guy only. I want to go back 15 or 16 centuries and see what the sages had to say. And not surprisingly, they shed a whole lot of light on the family dynamic in Joseph. So that will be out, Lord willing, next year sometime. The Lord blessed Eitan with writing gift as well. And this is a book he did a couple years ago called What About Us, in quotes, and it's, what's the role of the Gentiles in this whole messianic Jewish phenomenon? Really, what's the role of Gentiles in the whole restoration of Israel? And he covers that from the biblical sources and ties into his own story. So take a look.
Holy Spirit.